Hello, I'm Hannah Kendall and I'm a composer. I am from London, northwest London, born and bred, but currently living in New York. And my family is from Guyana, which is in the Caribbean, or part of the Caribbean, but actually it's technically in South America. I am Hannah Kendall. I am a woman. I am European. I'm British. I'm English. It's interesting it's come in that order, isn't it? Um, I am a storyteller. I'm a composer. I This is so difficult. I am I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm a very loyal friend. I am a change maker. So I grew up in a house that was filled with music. My grandfather was a jazz musician. He played the saxophone, and he always encouraged his children to play instruments from a very young age. And so my mum played the piano, and then so when we were growing up, that's something that she also wanted us to do. And so I played the violin from the age of 4. I was actually signed up for violin lessons without even knowing about it. And so one day I just went into school and there were lots of tiny violins in the classroom, and I haven't looked back since. So I fell in love with playing music, and I was this really geeky young girl. So at the age of 7, I started playing the piano, and I remember every Saturday I would go to the Willesden Green Library and take out CDs of Bach and Handel and just listen to lots of Baroque music at the age of 7, which sounds really unusual for a little girl growing up in northwest London, in Wembley. But then at the same time, we had lots of different music played at home, and so lots from the Caribbean. And then as I grew up to become a teenager, on the one hand, I was playing in youth orchestras, and then on the other hand, I was really getting into UK garage and grime, which was coming out at the time. And so I feel as though I was living this really eclectic musical life of listening to Baroque music and playing romantic music, and then going out and dancing to all the new tunes that were coming out on pirate radio stations in northwest London. So when I was growing up, I was playing a lot of music, which was really cool, and I was enjoying myself, and it was a really important part of my social life. But I didn't really think about becoming a professional musician, and I think that was because there wasn't really anyone like me doing that. I didn't see any black women performing classical music, and certainly not writing music, and I didn't even ever consider being a composer. But I ended up going to Exeter University and studying music, and primarily training as a singer, as well as doing all of the academic requirements for the degree. And then in my second year, they changed the credit systems, and I didn't have enough credit. So I needed to take 10 extra credits in order to graduate. And because in the first year, writing and composing was compulsory, I thought, oh, well, I quite enjoyed that. And, I liked the teacher who was teaching composition, Joe Dodell. So I ended up taking it in my second year. And he was so encouraging, and really supportive, and realised that I enjoyed writing much better than anything else, and I was pretty good at it. And he and the other lecturers at Exeter encouraged me to go on and apply for doing a master's in composition, and so I ended up going to the Royal College of Music, which was phenomenal and so useful in developing my personal voice. So I feel as though I started writing relatively late, in my early 20s, and had a lot of catching up to do, but my teacher at the Royal College, Ken Hesketh, was absolutely incredible and is still really supportive of me and my work. And so for the past 10 or so years, whilst I was developing my writing career, I had a portfolio career, really, and so I was working a lot in the industry, in arts management. So I started off at the Barbican, then ended up working for a music education charity, and I just felt as though it was the right time to really focus on writing and how I want to develop my practice. And so I applied to do a fellowship as part of the doctoral musical arts program at Columbia University in New York. Applied for that and got in, which is great. And being there is incredible because it's just helping me to develop my practice in a way that is just honing everything that I'm interested in artistically. And primarily that's actually reconciling my African Caribbean heritage within writing in the Western classical idiom. And, there aren't many people doing that. And I think that is, specifically what I'm interested in and part of my unique voice, and, something that I'm really enjoying taking even further. So for me, and with regards to my compositional style, it's incredibly important that my music is direct and clear and has clarity and speaks to people. And what I mean by that is that it's important that when the listener or when the audience member listens to the music that I've written, that they understand what it is that I'm trying to say through the notes. And so more often than not, there's a specific message that I'm trying to convey. And I suppose an example of that might be in one of my recent pieces called Vidala, which was written for the proms in 2018. So Vidala was about the Windrush generation, really, or it was a piece written in response to that. So the whole concert was actually commemorating the end of World War One. And the Vidala was the ship that brought over the Caribbean regiment over to Europe to fight in World War One. The involvement of African soldiers and Caribbean soldiers and Indian soldiers, or any soldier who wasn't from Europe, has, I think, been omitted from history. We don't know much about that, and so I wanted to highlight their involvement in the war. I wanted to call the piece Vidala because I think we've forgotten that there were many, many ships before Windrush that have involved African Caribbean people in Europe's history. And so, that's a very bold message that I wanted to get across through the music itself. And more specifically because 2018 is the year that the Windrush scandal happened. And again, I think mostly that happened because we don't have a detailed knowledge or as much depth of knowledge of African Caribbean people within European history. And so I think that comes across through the music, through Well, just, through its boldness and directness, I'd say my music, if I was going to describe it, is very much that. It's incredibly intricate, so it's a lot of layers coming together. So, when I look at it on a page on a score, it makes sense. But I think if individual musicians were to receive their parts, it wouldn't necessarily make sense until they come together. So it's lots of intricate lines that come together almost like a jigsaw. But actually the whole is very heavily punctuated and quite rhythmic, and I do think that comes from the music that I was listening to when I was growing up. And I mean popular music, so grime and garage, which probably isn't in the forefront. So I wouldn't imagine that anyone would listen to my music and think, oh yeah, it's influenced by grime and garage. But I know that it's there, and the mechanisms that I'm using very much emulate that. And so that idea of connecting with people and making classical music, especially classical music today, making it relevant and wanting to reach wider audiences, I'm very much concerned about choosing subject matters that might connect to people who wouldn't ordinarily go to a classical music concert. My father is from Antigua and my mother is from Guyana, even though she grew up here. She came over to the UK when she was 2, but we still have connections to Guyana. We still have family there, and we go back regularly. And a few years ago, after having been asked to write pieces about my connection to London in particular, because obviously as a Londoner and growing up here, I started to think about more about my heritage, thinking about how I can draw it into the music that I'm writing and the works that I wanted to focus on. And so I started doing research and looking into Guyanese artists, Guyanese writers, creative Guyanese people, and there is such a wealth of creativity that comes from Guyana. It's absolutely phenomenal. And I was particularly drawn to the poetry and the life of Martin Carter, who was a political activist campaigning for the independence of Guyana from the United Kingdom in the 50s and 60s. Well, his whole life really, but sort of focusing on that period in his life in particular. And just being drawn to the beauty of his poetry, which is multifaceted, but also had very clear and direct points about why Guyana should be independent from the United Kingdom. And there was a point in his life where he was imprisoned without charge for his political views. And I started thinking about whether I could make something of that. And having met a scholar who specialises in Caribbean poetry, so Dr. Gemma Robinson, who is absolutely phenomenal, and speaking with her some more, and she actually met him, worked with him, has studied his poetry, she helped me realise that it would be possible to think about writing a piece of music theatre. And so that became The Knife of Dawn being one of his incredibly powerful and evocative poems. Around that time, because I was working in the music industry in the UK as well, there was a lot of talk about diversifying classical music, and also I was just, getting to understand more the frustrations that I have, within that subject matter of diversifying classical music, and, realising that every time there was a production of Otello, that it was exactly the same news article that was written as, whether that character would be blacked up or whether, that character wouldn't be. And, I just thought, well, wouldn't it be easier and much simpler to write an opera that is written specifically for someone of African Caribbean heritage? And so I feel with The Knife of Dawn, it was bringing together all of the aspects that I was interested in, not only creatively with my music and my artistry and drawing in African Caribbean heritage, but also what I'm interested in on a wider level and what I think should be happening within the industry. And so that was that was the piece where I addressed all of those things and ended up producing it myself. Because of my background in arts management, that's something, I had the skills to do, which is absolutely fine. I mean, I don't think I would recommend it. I got shingles and I'm literally scarred from the experience, but I am pleased that I did it. The Knife of Dawn ended up being a collection of Martin Carter's poems, which were drawn together. So 6 poems were drawn together into an overarching story, encapsulating that period when he was imprisoned and on a hunger strike, actually. And Tessa McWatt, who's a writer, she wrote the libretto working in those beautiful poems, and Eric Greene performed the role of Martin Carter, and it was at the Roundhouse in 2016, and it was such an incredible experience. I produced it myself, and I wouldn't. I don't think I'd do that again. I think I was quite naive in the amount of work that it takes to not only produce a chamber opera but to also write one. But it was incredible in the sense that I'm really proud that now there's a substantial piece of work for a singer of African Caribbean heritage to perform. And with this piece, that there can never be a debate or conversation about the type of person who would need to perform it. And I'm also really proud by the fact that the audience was so diverse, and that actually 45% of the audience was Black, Asian, minority ethnic. And I was really purposeful about the piece being performed not at a venue that's traditionally associated with classical music. So it's at the Roundhouse, which is a pop music venue. There was a performance that was specifically for young people, and one of my favourite moments from the whole process was that the Q&A session after that performance overran by about 45 minutes, because these young people who had never been to an opera before, never mind a contemporary classical opera, were so engrossed in the story, and they were interested in Martin Carter's life, and they could see parallels, and there was relevancy in the story for them, and they were hungry to know more, and that's something that I will never forget. And so since that moment, really, I've been trying to emulate that in the commissions that I've had since. And so I'll always ask if there's an opportunity to reach wider audiences through the works that I'm writing. I do think very clearly and purposefully about the subjects that I want to address through the music that I'm writing to diversify the stories that are being told. I've spoken about this before, where I think of composers as being storytellers, and I think we have a responsibility to also think about the stories that we're telling to our audiences. And that's important to me. I mean, obviously, not all composers have to take that on board, but it's certainly something that I think about. And so, you know, that's where the subject of for Dala came from, and the subject for Processional, which was sort of looking back to the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King, and, you know, all of these stories that might not necessarily be remembered or you know, be put out there if I wasn't purposefully speaking about them. My music is intricate, it is bold, it's direct, it is rhythmic. I imagine that the audience might like to dance to it a lot of the time. That's really cool. My music always tells a story. It's multi-layered. It might be saying one thing on the surface, but deep down it's saying something else. There are many different influences, and I think one person might think it's one influence, but actually something's coming from another place. And I'll try and describe that in a way that, because I am of African Caribbean heritage, but very much working within a Western classical idiom, and being British, having grown up in Europe, where, you know, that the history of this kind of stuff that we're talking about originated. What I'm finding is that some people can have very specific ideas about what my music is and what it should be, but isn't necessarily that. And so, for example, as I've mentioned, I think that grime and garage is very much interwoven into my music. I know it is. Like, that's where the boldness and the directness comes from. And I like that because it's very, grime and garage is very specific to the second, third generation African Caribbean immigrants in London. That's so specific, and I'm part of that. It is, you know, it's black music that is so specific to London. And I think we forget that when we think of black culture, we automatically associate that with African Americanism. And so I think that's why I really enjoy garage and grime, but I really, really like that. It's so specific to where I grew up, and it was budding around the time that I was growing up in my formative years. So there's that on the one hand, and then within the same piece, the harmonic structure can come from sort of a synthetic harmonic structure that I've built based on a lullaby that my Guyanese grandmother used to sing to us when we were growing up as children. And so on the one hand, there's, you know, this urban populism in my music, and on the other hand, there's this Guyanese traditional aspect. And, you know, I know it's in there, and yet people listening to it may not know or may not pick up on it. And then, in fact, they might think it's something else. You know, so I find that quite interesting. And then On the other hand, some people might listen to my music and think it sounds, very Western, very contemporary classical music, in quotes, and might not be able to pick up on all of those aspects I've just described. And so those are the different layers that I'm talking about that can be going on in my music at any given time. I'm really excited about my latest piece, which is called Disillusioned Dreamer. It's for orchestra. It's for the Berkeley Symphony Orchestra in California. It's the first piece that I have written knowing that I'm not wholly based in the United Kingdom, and that's sort of interesting as an artist. I mean, for obvious reasons, I've spoken a lot about my influences and my musical influences, having grown up and having lived in London for most of my life. But now I'm in New York. That is actually a huge shift as a writer and as a composer, which is something that I had sort of thought about, but I hadn't really considered until I'd written this piece. And so all of the musical influences that I'm used to have sort of been shifted out of focus, and it's actually been, if I'm honest, it's been really difficult, because I'm sort of picking up the aspects of being in a new place, which I think is great actually for this piece in particular, because Disillusioned Dreamer is not only very difficult to say, it is also a line from Invisible Man, which is one of the most life-changing books that I've read, by Ralph Ellison, which is a huge book in the United States, but isn't as well known here. And it's an incredible book in the sense that it touches on, I think, black male vulnerability, which is something that isn't really looked at or really covered in art, I don't think. And so it was incredibly life-changing for me for not only that reason, but because it's the story of a man who comes to the realization that his race renders him invisible in society. And, I think anyone would probably pick up on the common thread that I'm interested in, telling stories that wouldn't necessarily be told otherwise, and hearing perspectives and voices from those who feel voiceless. I'm into social justice, basically. I think that's incredibly important, and that's coming through the music that I'm writing, essentially. And so it's just this, I mean, that story is just incredible, coming to the realization, having been sold the lie that you have a place at the table, but actually coming to the realization, because of the colour of your skin, the personal realization, that due to the colour of your skin, that you are actually completely unseen. So that all of these things, how do you get that into a piece of orchestral music? Well, that's why it's been quite difficult. And so, the piece is, I think, very different to what it would have been had I, written it a year ago, living completely in London. And so I think that's absolutely fascinating. And the music that's come out is wildly different to what it would have been. It certainly has my footprint, the intricacy, the boldness, but the way that the notes have been manipulated are in completely new ways. And so I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm equally nervous about it as well. So I would recommend to someone who has never heard of my work to listen to Vera, which is actually one of my first pieces. I wrote it whilst I was still a student at the Royal College of Music. And so that might seem like an odd suggestion, but I'm still really fond of it because I think it does actually encapsulate all of my musical ideas and what I try to bring across in my music, that boldness, that directness, funkiness, funky rhythms, and I think I've spent, however many years, 10, 15 years sort of going on a journey, on a musical journey, and I'm certainly going through musical transition again at the moment, but actually that piece just really brings everything that I'm interested in together in one whole. I don't feel pigeonholed at all. I write what I want to write and what I want to write about. But I suppose I'm wary of the fact, due to the subjects that are important to me and that I want to bring to the fore, that others might want to pigeonhole me. And so that's a really interesting question. And I think because of that, I could be afraid of writing about those things because, for example, if I choose to write about the Windrush scandal, others may want to pigeonhole me as only writing about black subjects or, whatever it is. And so that is quite interesting and, something that I am trying to work out artistically, but it would never stop me from touching on those subjects because I think they are incredibly important. And sure, they're mostly uncomfortable, but I think because we're not talking about these things openly and the reasons behind we get to these, well, in this case, a scandal, I think that's why they're happening and going unnoticed. And I sort of think, a lot of the time I think, in however many years, and, if we look back to 2018 and, we could have gone by without any piece of art or music or whatever that hasn't referenced this monumental crisis, or scandal, or whatever it is. And so I suppose I do think about that a lot. On the other hand, I've been thinking about, I really love nature, and I might just want to write a piece about nature. And so actually I'm doing that in my next piece with a bit of a twist, because I'm interested again in the fact that, I really love getting out of the city and going to rural settings, but actually there are a whole load of issues associated with that as well. And being the only person, more often than not, of colour within these settings. And so this is actually, I really like this question because it's something that's very much at the front of my mind at the moment.